Amen, and thank you again for coming to hear what we have to teach about apologetics this morning. We don't have a ton of time, and there's a lot to cover. I've had 4-hour conversations about what I'm about to discuss, so I'm going to try to cut it down to 30 minutes and not miss anything important. Last week we discussed an overview of apologetics, the branch of Christian theology that seeks to give a rational justification for the Christian faith. And first we had offensive apologetics, not offensive. Offensive, giving a positive case for Christianity as an all-encompassing worldview. And then we had defensive apologetics, where we were discussing fielding the questions and the objections of opposition worldviews. Today we're going to look at offensive apologetics as I present the rational case for Christianity. We'll be starting, as we discussed last week, with natural theology, and then later we'll move to the Christian evidences. Let's get going. Quick note, I will not be using the, hold on, are these the old notes? These look like, nope, these are the same notes, sorry. I will not be using the Bible for natural theology. I know, I got a lot of raised eyebrows there. It might seem like a boxing match with both arms tied behind my back. But what's the reasoning for that? How do we make that case? First, the Bible is actually where this category comes from. I actually have it written there. So in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, Paul makes the case that even those who have never heard of the gospel or have never heard of the God of Israel are still accountable to him, quote, "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." There's an obviousness to the existence of God that is self-evident in nature and its laws. Natural theology illuminates that fact without resorting to the Bible then, because the use of the Bible in this case would be reasoning in a circle. So this is where we get the philosophical category, but we also want to seek the first parts of this truth in God's general revelation first, before we turn to his special revelation to learn the rest. So if you don't recall, last week we were talking about what the goal is for natural theology, and its main goal is to prove that God exists. What kind of God he is, what are his nature and character and attributes are for other works to discuss. But by God, what do we mean? We mean a all-powerful, all-knowing, ever-present creator being who is the uncaused cause at the beginning of all that exists outside of time, that kind of thing. And that's what we're going to be discussing right now. So before I go too much further on that point, I want to discuss the role of evidence in faith, and in specifically the Christian faith. So there's a pernicious idea that pervades some churches, not necessarily this one, but some, that Christianity is a religion of faith, so defined as like a radical, almost blind trust in God, without regard to any opposing ideas or anything outside of the Bible itself. The problem with that is the Bible. The word faith in the Bible is this one right here. It's pronounced pistis. It's elsewhere used to mean good faith, trustworthy, reliable, believable, evident, those kinds of things. And so it's the root from which we get actually epistemology. Have you ever heard of the word epistemology? It's the study of how we know things. That's where that word comes from, and that's its Greek root. So God has a high regard for evidence. He has a very high regard for evidence. Moses, with the snake staff as a sign to the Egyptians, the excruciating historical detail in the Old Testament and the Gospels, like Luke. If you haven't read the first couple of chapters of Luke, just look at all of the historical details that are given to you, like Quirinius as governor of Syria, and when there was a census that went out, and Luke's mission statement at the beginning where he says that these things were compiled so that you may have certainty in what you believe. The first instance in the Bible of God telling Moses to write something down on the scroll of remembrance, things like that. Jesus claiming the prophecies of Scripture as evidence for his deity and his nature. These show God has a high regard for the evidence, showing his work, as we talked about last week, and proofs, to the point that it forms a pretty astounding amount of his own words to humanity. So faith would then be better defined as trusting in something which you have good reasons to believe, and belief then is also better defined as a movement toward faith, so defined. So I have the more appropriate definitions of faith and belief there written. The Bible is not just the holy word of God, although, oh my gosh, what an amazing thing to have in your hands, right? And although we are leaving it mostly to the side for natural theology, it's also an incredibly reliable collection of primary sources that'll be useful later with regard to the Christian evidences. So then let's start with natural theology, the goal of which, again, is to prove the existence of a God, a monotheistic God, and if successful, this would exclude, as we talked last week, atheism, agnosticism, pantheism, polytheism, vague deism, Gnosticism, and a million other isms which form the basis of belief for every religion in the world but four: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and then theism. That's what natural theology is about. So you've heard it said that all truth is God's truth, and if we believe that to be the case, we ought to be unafraid to follow the evidence where it leads. So, this talk, I will be very frank, will make some of you guys uncomfortable, and I'm okay with that. I have to tread gingerly because I'm going to introduce some philosophical, historical, and maybe even some scientific categories that are very new, very different, and some of them pretty controversial. Be warned, but take heart. These things form an ironclad case for Christianity as an all-encompassing worldview, as communicated to someone who does not already believe it, and have been developed as a tool to elevate the glory of God. So with that, we'll begin. Sometimes natural theology is associated, as I said, with general revelation, and that general revelation is general in two senses. First, it's available to all of mankind at any time in human history, and secondly, it is general in the sense that it gives general information about God. For example, through general revelation, we may learn that God exists, but we would not learn that God is a Trinity. We would need special revelation to learn that. So the arguments of natural theology attempt to give those evidences and arguments for the existence of God in this very general sense. The case here is based upon and then supported by several syllogistic arguments. Now, you probably are already very bored, so I'm going to try to make this a little bit more interesting. This is a philosophical and logical construct that you've heard all kinds of times. It's premise 1 and premise 2, therefore premise 3, right? So all birds lay eggs. A swan is a bird, therefore swans lay eggs. It's just a way of making two true statements and then a conclusion which follows logically and inescapably from the premises, right? So the first such argument in natural theology that I like to talk about is the Kalam cosmological argument. This is actually at this point, it's a 1,400-year-old argument for the existence of God that has never been refuted. The entire evidential basis upon which you would refute it has been ripped to shreds by modern science. It's great, so let's dig in. So the cosmological argument comes then from the Greek word cosmos, which means world. It's the family of arguments. This isn't the only one. But it's trying to say that there's a first cause or a sufficient reason for the existence of the world. The cosmological argument comes in a variety of versions. We have first the Kalam version, but I'll get to the contingency version in a minute. This one's also called the temporal version because it involves time. So this argument argues that whatever begins to exist has to have a cause. Things don't just pop into being out of nothing. And the universe began to exist, so therefore the universe must have a cause. This argument would depend upon proving that the universe is not eternal in the past, as atheists long maintained. We'll get to that in a minute too. That we've either good philosophical or scientific reasons for thinking that the universe is not infinite in the past but began to exist and therefore has a cause. Then one would try to deduce or unpack what some of the attributes would have to be of this cause of the universe, and you'll see that they sound pretty remarkably like God. Then we have the contingency argument. So that one runs along these lines. Basically, it says anything that exists has to have an explanation of why it exists. Not just a cause, but an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in some external cause. Then we'll argue that the universe is a thing which contingently exists. It doesn't exist by a necessary reason. It isn't self-existent. There's no reason why there has to be a universe. There could be no universe. So it's a contingent existence. And then we say this contingency version can work even if the universe is eternal, but again, the science rips that to shreds. But why does an eternal universe exist instead of just nothing? There has to be a sufficient reason for the existence of the universe, and this one's been around since Aristotle, and it holds firm. Next is the teleological argument. I'm sorry for the note takers again, I'll post the slides on the GroupMe Appreciate you guys. So in addition to the cosmological arguments, another argument for the existence of God that finds a prominent place in natural theology is the teleological argument from the Greek word telos, which means end or goal or purpose. So the teleological argument basically says that the universe exhibits incredible complexity, not just random complexity, but specified complexity. And that the complexity cannot be plausibly explained away as either due to physical necessity or due to chance. Therefore, the best explanation of the complex order in the universe is that it is due to design. There is a transcendent, intelligent mind which has designed the universe, is essentially the claim. So this argument in particular, it's probably my favorite. It's traditionally thought in the culture we live in to have been invalidated, or at least delivered a severe blow by Darwinian evolution. But in recent years, the teleological argument has come roaring back into prominence because of the discovery of scientists in the last few decades that, wholly apart from biological evolution, which has been, it's on its way out too, and we can talk about that another time, in order for evolution to even take place, the initial conditions of the universe, given in the initial creation event, have to be so fine-tuned to an extremely complex degree that it's incomprehensible that it wasn't the act of creating intelligence, designing intelligence. So, although there's an increasing movement even at an academic level away from Darwinian evolution, which obviously, right? We just don't have the time here to dive into all the details because it's, again, 4-hour conversations about this. But I'll give a list of resources at the end. There'll be more this week, so no pictures. A third argument so third family of arguments for natural theology is the moral argument. This one I've found is most powerful with young people, with people who don't necessarily care about all the heady philosophical and scientific proofs, but really care about wanting to do the right thing and wanting there to be a true right and wrong which people are objectively bound by, even if they don't agree or even if they don't publicly state that. So there are a lot of different versions, but the version I've found particularly persuasive goes like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. That is to say, moral values which are valid and binding, independent of whether anybody believes in them or not. Many atheists and theists alike agree on this point. If there is no God, then moral values among human beings are just spin-offs of socio-biological evolution or culturally and relatively socially just relative, and there's no transcendent anchor point to secure their objectivity. But it's evident that objective values do exist. In our moral experience, and not just us, but cultures all around the world and all through history, we apprehend a realm of objectively existing moral values. Almost everyone would agree that there is a moral difference between loving a child, for instance, and brutally abusing that little child. These are not morally indifferent acts or subject to what a culture at large believes about them. They are morally reprehensible, or the brutal abuse of a child is a morally reprehensible act no matter where you live or what you were raised to believe. And even people who commit acts of abuse to anybody, there is almost always a profound sense of internal guilt that they can't explain, even if they felt like what they were doing was the right thing at the time. If you do any chronology or study of the mindset of people that commit crimes, this is evident even in their stories. But if it's the case that objective moral values exist and the objective moral values cannot exist without God, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists. So those are some of the arguments, just four arguments that belong to the field of natural theology. There are a lot more. I don't want to go over too many more. The reason why I brought up these four is because I want to have some fun with you guys. I want to weave them together, okay? It's time for us to have a little bit of fun. So, here on this line, here is the beginning, okay? And on the right side of this line is the universe, time, space, everything that exists inside of the universe. And this is what exists before the universe, causally, let's say. So, first I want to say this. The Big Bang is a hot-button topic as an idea. And I want to put it to you that the idea of it, at least, is not some huge Christian evil, as long as we point out the one who banged it. Atheists and naturalists hate the Big Bang Theory because of what it implies. They hate it. They hate it. They hate it even more since it was enshrined as a proof, a theorem in hard science as recently as 2003 with the Borg-Kuth-Vilenkin theorem. Einstein himself had equations for his general and special relativity equations that implied a beginning. And so what did he do but fake the equation and invalidate it by adding something that he called the cosmological constant so that he could keep the universe eternally, because he didn't want to see the implications of a beginning. He didn't want to face them. Later he would go to the Hubble Space Telescope and look out at the stars and walk out to the media gathered there and say in his thick German accent, "I now see the necessity of a beginning." Atheists invent all sorts of mental gymnastics to avoid the Big Bang because it stands as nothing less than the best extra-biblical evidence for the existence of God in all of science. Nothing less. What the Big Bang does not mean is a beginning of an extremely complicated universe from nothing or with no cause. If someone tells you that the Big Bang means that the universe began out of nothing, what they are describing to you is literally worse than magic. Because at least with magic, you have a magician, a rabbit, and a hat. Here, the magician, the rabbit, and the hat all just appear for no reason and with no beginning cause. And then you have to ask why things don't pop into existence out of nothing all the time. Atheists can't stand the Big Bang, you guys. So whether you think this happened 16,000 years ago or 14.2 billion years ago is less important than that it happened. It is happened and that it is an incontrovertible fact that makes it such a powerful proof for the existence of God. I have to say that because there are scores of Christians on both sides, and that is much more of an intramural discussion among believers than it is a linchpin of one or the other being a linchpin of our faith and the other one's being invalidated. Because it's not quite a linchpin of our faith to say that the universe is 16,000 years old, because it doesn't necessarily mean old Earth and Big Bang does not equal atheism and evolution, and it doesn't even equal Bible denier. There's just a different interpretive lens that gets used. We can have a talk about this. I'm sure you hate me right now. Sure you disagree with me. I'm not quite. I'm willing to talk if you guys have any ideas or questions you want to point things out to me too. I'd love to grab a cup of coffee. We don't have time now, just to give you guys some new categories. So again, when it happened doesn't matter so much as that it happened. Agreed? Agreed. So in order for the universe to be life-permitting, the force of gravity, okay, this is, I gotta break this down, because it gets insane. So I'm just gonna have some fun with you guys. All right, so if the universe has space and time and material, clearly there's a massive amount of information of enormous complexity. There's life, and if we apprehend morality, as we did, right, objective morality, laws, and design, where, again, when we get to the design, you guys, your brains are going to melt. If we apprehend these things, then whatever is the cause of those things, right, on the left side of this beginning line, has to either exhibit the opposite quality or an absence of that quality in order for it to exist as a cause. So you have space on this side of the beginning. The cause of the beginning must be spaceless. Make sense? We have time only exists inside of the universe, therefore what caused the universe must be timeless. You have material inside of the universe, matter, cells, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. Whatever existed to cause that must be immaterial. Massive information, this is the interesting one. If we're expecting an input of information, we always interpret that as an act of a mind, don't we? If you were walking on the beach and you saw the first 3 letters of your first name written in the sand, you would not interpret that as having been done by the waves or the random forces of nature. There's an intelligence with a stick drawing the name, is what you think, right? Information is always the input of an intelligence, and it's an input of a mind. So the enormously complex nature of the universe means that the cause of it must have a greater level of complexity in order for it to exhibit that level of complexity. Simple things don't make more complex things unless they are component. But if we're talking about a single cause, it has to be more complex than what it's causing. And then if we're seeing life, this cause has to be life-generating. That's just self-evident. It's truism. And then this one, if we see morality, law, and design, what we are left with is a moral agent mind. So what do I mean by that? An agent is something that can choose to enact a cause. So it's something sentient, right? A person or an animal or something like that, that can choose then to enact a cause. I can choose to eat a sandwich in the same way that a lion could choose to eat me. These are agents. They can make choices to enact changes. So the fact that the universe began to exist at some point anyway necessarily means that there was an agent who chose to cause it into existence. And he was a moral and agent mind. So if you're an atheist and you're faced with these proofs and you're faced with this discussion, you don't have to call him God. You just have to call him a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, enormously informed, excruciatingly complex, life-generating moral agent mind. And we're talking about the same thing. So the next thing, we're going to start getting the teleological argument in. So in 1967, Time magazine ran a cover story that was in big red letters that said, "Is God dead?" They were wondering, there was a big philosophical discussion, Nietzsche was going on, they were discussing, is God dead? That same year, the famed Carl Sagan proposed that a planet only needs two things for it to be life-permitting. Two things. Number one, the right kind of star, and number two, the planet needs to be the right distance from that star. So the thinking went that there would be 10 to the 70th existing planets, that's 10 with 70 zeros after it, that exist in the whole universe, and 10 to the 60th of them were life candidates. The thinking went. The odds were great. So there was a whole government agency launched called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, combing the universe for any kind of a signal. And in the intervening years, the problem got worse and worse and worse. And it went from 2 to about 250 now. We have 250 things that all need to be in place. About 100 of those need to be exactly right for there to even be a universe in the first place. So the odds went from, you got 10 to the 60th power possible planets, to the odds being so overwhelmingly against there being life on any planet at all, anywhere in the universe, that it would be akin to flipping a coin 100 billion times in a row and getting heads every single time. That's how unlikely this is. So, just one of these, I've highlighted this one, they're all arbitrary, but I've just highlighted this one. Just one of these is utterly, totally, incomprehensibly unlikely. So if you find yourself in the group of Christians that think that the universe was 14.2 billion years old, whatever, if you think that, then the number of seconds that have transpired since the beginning of time would be 10 to the 18th or 10 to the 20th, depending on how you do the math, right? 10 to the 20th seconds since the beginning of time. If you were to count up all of the subatomic particles in the known universe, not just atoms, not molecules, I'm talking, electrons, protons, neutrons, quarks, all the things we don't even really know about yet. If you were to count them all up in the entire known universe, you'd land on 10 to the 80th subatomic particles in the whole known universe. This here represents the ratio of the force of gravity to the weak force of the atom. And if either one of those was changed by 1 part in 10 to the 100th power, you have no universe to begin with. 1 part in more subatomic particles than exist in the entire known universe. If you change it by that, it's like throwing a dart into the universe and trusting that you'll hit the right one, and that's better odds. It's better odds. So if you change it 1 part this way, right? Think of these 200 circles I've given you as little oven dials, where you could have a million or a billion or a trillion different values on there, but there's a little red line marked on the oven dial where it has to be right inside of that. It's not even a range, it's one number. It has to be right on that number, or you get no universe, or you get no life. And every single one of them has to be tuned perfectly. Roger Penrose, who was Stephen Hawking's lab partner, calculated the math when he was asked what the possibility was that this was all done by chance. And he said that it was 1 chance in 10 to the 10 to the 134th power. which means that there are 10 to the 134th zeros after the number. It's an incomprehensible number. You could put a 0, again, on every subatomic particle or every atom in the known universe and not have enough space to write the zeros for that number. Mind-blowing. Mind-blowing. So that's just one of them, right? There are a million others. We could talk about them in detail. I geek out about this stuff. If you want to grab coffee and talk about teleological, cosmological fine-tuning, I would love that. I'll try not to take 4 hours, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming. So the verdict, these are a couple of quotes from well-known non-theists who, when faced with the evidence, had their beliefs shaken. The first one is Fred Hoyle, who is none other than the person who coined the term the Big Bang. He says, "A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature." Pretty staggering admission. John O'Keefe, a senior research fellow at a major university, says, "We are by astronomical standards a pampered, cosseted, cherished group of creatures. If the universe had not been made with the most exacting precision, we could never have come into existence. It is my view that these circumstances indicate the universe was created for man to live in." That man's not a theist. He's certainly not a Christian. But his observation of the evidence is, you have to admit, it sure looks like it's been designed for life. And that's a pretty staggering thought. So, we're going to get into the Bible now, because I love you guys and I don't want to make you too uncomfortable. Now to the Christian evidences. So what are some of the typical Christian evidences? One would be fulfilled prophecy, right? Another would show that, a person would show that in the Old Testament prophecies are given, particularly of the coming of Christ, and then the chances of this happening by accident alone or by purposeful design are negligible, and therefore this is best explained by the fact that God had revealed what would happen in the future to these prophets, and that therefore this indicates and authenticates the message of these prophets, and particularly the persons predicted by them. Another evidence of Christian truth would be Jesus of Nazareth's own radical claims. There's been a tremendous resurgence of interest in the historical Jesus as New Testament scholars and historians sift through the Gospels and the New Testament materials to discover what the historical Jesus was really like. What one can show is that the historical Jesus made certain very radical claims about himself that show that he cannot be simply treated as a rabbi or a prophet or a religious teacher. Claims to be, for example, the Son of Man, predicted in Daniel 7, claims to be the unique Son of God, claims by which he put himself in the place of God by arrogating to himself prerogatives and properties that only God can have. For example, the privilege of forgiving sins, or the ability to overturn and revise the Old Testament law given through Moses. It was these radical personal claims that led C.S. Lewis to argue that you'd have to say that either Jesus of Nazareth was a madman, or else he was a liar, or else he was really who he claimed to be. And the most plausible explanation of these three is that he was telling the truth. He really was the Son of Man, come to inaugurate God's kingdom on earth, especially if you have crossed the wide chasm from atheism to theism, as proven by natural theology. It's a chip shot. You're already on the green to putt into Christianity. It's the easiest thing in the world if you can get to theism. Finally, a third Christian evidence, and this is my personal favorite, would be the evidence for Jesus' miracles and resurrection. I like to see the miracles and resurrection of Jesus within the context of his radical personal claims that we just mentioned, because it is his miracles and especially his resurrection that validate or confirm the radical personal claims that Jesus made. It may surprise you to learn that the majority of New Testament critics today, even the atheist ones, in comparison to a generation or a century ago, recognize that the historical Jesus performed miracles. Now, they might explain that away as like a psychosomatic healing or something, but they do not deny that Jesus carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. He performed acts which, in his view and in the view of those around him, were supernatural acts wrought by God. In particular, the evidence of Jesus' resurrection is important because if Jesus has been raised from the dead, then that means that the God of Israel, who was allegedly blasphemed by this Jesus, and for that reason was put to death, that this God has vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims by raising Jesus from the dead. So there are the four historical facts. This is where we get to the meat of it. Just real quick, you're likely to hear about these in a sermon, and that's a great thing. That's a really wonderful thing. We have a really high regard for the Bible and the history of the Bible. Pastor always brings these things up. So I'm going to give an atheist-facing case, as all of this has been. I'm going to give an atheist-facing case for the truth of the resurrection of Jesus. So this is called the minimal facts case for the resurrection of Jesus. There are four historical facts which are proven by the evidence which are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Number one, his honorable burial by Joseph of Arimathea. It's completely undisputed. These facts are completely undisputed. 99% of New Testament scholars agree that these are true given the body of evidence. Again, I have to stress to you, even the atheist ones. Even the atheist ones. So, number one, his honorable burial by Joseph of Arimathea. Number two, the discovery of his empty tomb. Number three, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus to various individuals and groups. And then finally, number four, the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. After establishing those four facts, I could then argue that the most plausible historical explanation of those facts is that these men were telling the truth, that God did in fact raise Jesus from the dead, and therefore Jesus' radical personal claims for which he was crucified are vindicated. Now, how do we know that these are all true? There is truly an insane amount of scholarship done on this, and I just want to show you how ironclad the case is, no matter what you might have been told to the contrary. So, in terms of dating and timing, one of the oldest passages in the New Testament is the creed that Paul delivers in 1 Corinthians 15. There's a sharp break in the way that he writes it, which in the Greek it flows like it was an oral saying. And this dates back to within about 2 or 3 years of the event of Jesus' crucifixion and the resurrection. 2 or 3 years. To give you some perspective, I'll get to this slide again in a minute. To give you some perspective, as far as like manuscript evidence of a person existing, here's some notable names that might give you some pause. So, the works of Aristotle, you know how many manuscripts we have of his works? 5 copies. And they're dating about 1,400 years after his life. 1,400 years. How about Plato? 7 copies. 1,200 years after his life. The best evidence we have for the existence of Plato is 1,200 years after when he was said to live. But does anybody doubt that he was a historical figure? No. Alexander the Great, no copies of anything that was written by him to generals or anything like that. No copies. And the earliest biography we have is 400 years after by Plutarch. So 2 to 3 years looks pretty darn good. Okay, and this is just for evidence of the discussion surrounding Jesus, not to mention anything about the truth of the claims. So the people that lived in Jerusalem had no preconceived notion of a resurrection. That was not a Jewish belief, at least a resurrection before the end of all things when the faithful would be brought back to life. They didn't have an idea that one person would be brought back to life, pretty much all. That wasn't in their so the way I say it is, nobody expected nobody. Okay? Nobody expected nobody. And then they let themselves be killed for their insistence upon that resurrection, upon that fact. So here you have pictured, right here, the area where people professed to see Jesus alive from the dead and allowed themselves to be killed for it. And guess what? But in that same area, right in here, were all the people that could have quashed the rumor and proven it false with a body. Here are all of the people still in this little, 10 square mile town that could have proven it false, had a stake in wanting to prove it false, had the ability and the means, so to speak, militarily, to keep the word from getting out, and still could not stop it from happening. And it's authenticated by these earnest Jews who see something that upended their religious beliefs and then started to allow themselves to be killed rather than lie about it. It's pretty remarkable stuff. Again, I could talk for hours. So when I was talking about the manuscripts just now, right? 5 copies, 7 copies, 8 copies, 10 copies. The New Testament has been preserved in more manuscripts than any other ancient work of literature, with over 5,800 complete or at least slightly fragmented Greek manuscripts cataloged, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 manuscripts in various other ancient languages, including Syriac, Slavic, Gothic, Ethiopian, Coptic, Armenian, right? All of the regional dialects of those areas. You were talking 20,000 copies or fragments of copies of various ages across thousands of years. And you know what's amazing is that it's been really well preserved in that time. You'll hear somebody like Bart Ehrman, who I mentioned last week, say that the Bible is unreliable because there are hundreds of thousands of scriptural variants. The scriptural variants he's talking about is a misapplied plus, or a misapplied comma, or a misapplied space, or a misspelling of a word. And the only reason that is because we have such a sheer volume of them. You're not likely to find many spelling differences if you only have 5 copies. So this is the case that I make to start with. It's so hard to do in a half an hour. But the point is, natural theology gets you to God. Gets you to the existence of as we described him earlier, what was it? Spaceless, timeless, immaterial, amazingly complex moral agent mind, right? And then the evidence for Christianity so far overwhelms the evidence for any other religious explanation of the theist facts. It's overwhelming how much evidence there is. There have been, hundreds of thousands of books written on this, and I've cataloged a few of them for you guys. So again, the slides will be here for this, for you guys. I'll send them in the group me so that you have it available. There are a couple of really good ones in here, like J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity, Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. We talked about Mike Licona last week, remember? The guy that talked to Marty Sampson. The Case of the Resurrection of Jesus. There's a wealth of resources. You can look these guys up if you want to read more. But the point is, there is a proof. There are argumentative proofs that have existed for 1,400 years that no philosophical argument can assail. And they prove that you can get to a God. And then once you arrive there, the evidence, the honest body of evidence that exists for Christianity so far outstrips everything by a factor of 10 or 15,000 that any rational person who is open to the truth would at least concede that the most likely true worldview that exists in all of the world is Christianity. And you have notes for that now, and you have something that you can say to an atheist that doesn't presume the authority of the Bible to somebody who has no respect for it. That you can get them started thinking about what it is that they believe and why they're so confident in something that they believe without evidence, that they take on blind faith, even. If you talk to most atheists, what they believe is usually based on like a Star Trek quote or something. So that's my parting charge. Again, you can clearly see that there's a case to be made. Christianity is true for everyone in all places at all times, whether you like it or not. But again, as with last week, a robust and full-orbed evangelistic stance will require you to not merely state the facts of the case, but to embody and then communicate the love of the God you're defending. I can't overstate the importance of that. Entire dependence upon the Spirit, not on facts and reason, but on dependence on the Spirit, utilizing facts and reason as a tool to convince those who think that they know better. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this teaching. Thank you for the word, and thank you for the evidences and the obviousness of your existence, Lord, that you have given to us. And thank you for all of the men and women who have labored their whole careers to make known this evidence and to make known the over an abundance of truth that exists in the Christian worldview, be that apologists, be that scholars, be that pastors and lay people who love you and want to spread the truth. We are grateful to you for all of the ways in which you have worked in humanity. Most of all, Lord, we are grateful that everything that is said about you in your word that you have preserved for us is true, that you are all loving and that you are sovereign and that you leverage your power for the good of your creation. And ultimately, Lord, you sent us Jesus, who is the very image of your nature, and he sacrificed himself for us. The core of our faith is Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, which is a historical fact as incontrovertible as anything that you could ever see in history, Lord. And it's real, and it's the hope and the basis of our faith, and upon what we rest for our salvation and our relationship with you. So Lord, thank you for the confidence that comes from this. I pray that you would help us to leave from here to use it and to glorify your name through it. And would you just use us however you can in our lives, in our personal relationships, to your glory and honor forever and ever. Amen. Thank you, guys.